In the dying light of a desert town where justice hung as crooked as the cottonwood's branches, rancher Jed Harper witnessed something that would shatter 8 years of chosen silence. When the rope snapped taut and the Apache girl's body swayed in the evening wind, he saw what the blood-drunk crowd missed: her chest, still rising and falling in desperate stolen breaths. One man's knife could mean the difference between murder and mercy. But in Cold Pine, mercy was a luxury few could afford, and fewer still dared to offer. This is the story of how a broken man found his purpose in the breath of a dying girl, and how sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to let injustice have the final word. Stay with me until the end. This tale of redemption and resistance will take us through fire, blood, and the kind of courage that blooms only in the darkest of hours. And please comment below with your city or country so I can see how far this story of the American frontier has traveled across our world. The dust never settled in Cold Pine. It hung in the air like the ghosts of better days, swirling through the streets in endless spirals that coated everything in a fine layer of regret. Jed Harper had learned to live with dust, the same way he'd learned to live with silence as a companion that asked for nothing and gave even less in return. 8 years, 8 long years since he'd ridden into this godforsaken corner of New Mexico territory with nothing but grief in his saddlebags and a promise to his dead wife that he'd find a place where the world couldn't reach him. He'd kept that promise mostly. His ranch sat 12 miles north of town, carved out of scrubland that nobody else wanted, populated by longhorn cattle that were too stubborn to die and horses that were too wild to break completely. He came to town twice a month for supplies, spoke to the shopkeepers only when necessary, and ignored the curious stares of folks who'd long since given up trying to draw him into their conversations. Jed Harper was the ghost of Cold Pine, present but not participating, seen but not heard. Until tonight. The sun was bleeding out across the western sky when Jed tied his mare Patience to the hitching post outside McKinnon's general store. The streets were busier than usual, filled with the kind of restless energy that preceded either a celebration or a lynching. In Cold Pine, the difference was often academic. "Evening, Jed." Samuel McKinnon looked up from his ledger as the rancher stepped through the door, the bell above jingling like a funeral dirge. "Didn't expect to see you till next week. Running low on coffee," Jed replied, his voice rusty from disuse. He'd spoken more words to his horses in the past month than he had to humans. McKinnon nodded toward the street. "Might want to conduct your business quick tonight. Sheriff's got himself a prisoner, and you know how these things go." Through the window, Jed could see men gathering near the courthouse, their faces lit by torchlight, and something darker. He'd seen that look before in other towns, in other lives. It was the expression of men who'd convinced themselves that cruelty was justice, that violence was virtue. "What's the charge?" he asked, though he wasn't sure why he cared. "Apache girl, caught her stealing food from the Hendersons' place. Sheriff says she's been living rough in the hills, probably part of that band that hit the Murphy Ranch last month." Jed's hands stilled on the coffee sack he'd been examining. "She alone?" "Far as they can tell. Just a kid, really. Maybe 17, 18, but you know how folks feel about—" The sound of breaking glass cut through McKinnon's words. Outside, someone had thrown a bottle against the courthouse wall. The crowd was growing larger, louder, hungrier. "I'd finish up here and ride out Jed. This ain't gonna be pretty." But Jed found himself walking to the window instead, drawn by a morbid curiosity he couldn't name. The crowd had formed a rough circle around the courthouse steps, where Sheriff Tom Brackett stood with his arms crossed, surveying his domain like a king preparing to dispense justice. Brackett was a big man gone soft around the middle, with the kind of mustache that belonged in a daguerreotype, and eyes that had seen too much and learned too little. "Bring her out," someone shouted from the crowd. "Let's get this done," called another. Brackett raised his hands for silence. Now hold on, folks. I know you're all worked up about this, but we're gonna do this proper. Legal, like. Legal. A voice from the back of the crowd, thick with whiskey and contempt. Since when is there a legal way to deal with a thieving savage? The crowd murmured its agreement. These weren't bad people, Jed knew. They were farmers and shopkeepers, blacksmiths and clerks, ordinary folks who'd been ground down by the harsh realities of frontier life until their capacity for mercy had worn as thin as their patience. But knowing that didn't make what was about to happen any easier to watch. The territorial judge won't be through for another 3 weeks, Brackett continued, and we can't hold her that long on what we got, so I'm declaring this a matter of immediate public safety. What's that mean in plain English? Called out Martha Henderson, the woman whose food had allegedly been stolen. Means we handle it ourselves, tonight. The cheer that went up from the crowd was ugly, primitive, the sound of civilization's mask slipping to reveal the beast beneath. Jed felt his stomach turn. He'd seen enough frontier justice to know that it was usually neither just nor legal, just quick and final. "McKinnon," he said, without turning from the window. "You got that coffee ready? Jed, you really should. The coffee." The shopkeeper sighed and began wrapping the purchase in brown paper. Outside, the courthouse door opened and Deputy Frank Morrison emerged, his hand resting nervously on his gun butt. Behind him came another deputy, Jake Foley, and between them, Jed's breath caught in his throat. The girl couldn't have been more than 18, with long black hair that hung in tangles around a face that might have been pretty if it weren't swollen with bruises. Her dress, if the torn, dirty remnant could still be called that, had once been blue. Now it was the color of dried blood and despair. They'd bound her hands behind her back, and she walked with the careful gait of someone trying not to show how much each step hurt. But it was her eyes that stopped Jed cold. Even from a distance, even through the grimy window glass, he could see them dark and defiant, holding a fire that all the beatings in the world hadn't been able to extinguish. She wasn't broken. Beaten, yes. Bloodied, certainly, but not broken. "What's her name?" he found himself asking. McKinnon glanced up from his wrapping. "Don't rightly know. Sheriff just calls her the prisoner." Why? Jed didn't answer. He couldn't explain the strange pull he felt, the way something inside his chest, something he'd thought dead for 8 years, was stirring to life. Maybe it was the way she held her head high despite everything. Maybe it was the reminder of his own wife Sarah, who'd faced down a tornado with that same unflinching courage. Or maybe it was just the simple, terrible recognition that he was about to watch an innocent person die, and he was the only one in this whole damn town who seemed to care. The crowd was moving now, flowing like a river toward the old cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the town square. Someone had already thrown a rope over the strongest branch, the noose swaying gently in the evening breeze, like a pendulum counting down the last moments of a life. "Here." McKinnon pushed the wrapped coffee across the counter. "Take it and go. Nothing good ever came from watching these things." But Jed was already moving toward the door, his coins scattered across the counter. "Keep the change." "Jed, don't." The bell jingled one last time as the door swung shut behind him. The street was chaos. Men and women pressed together, their faces ugly with excitement and righteousness. Children ran between the adults' legs, turned loose by parents too distracted by the promise of violence to maintain proper supervision. The air reeked of sweat and whiskey, and something else, the metallic scent of blood already spilled. Jed pushed through the crowd, using his height and breadth to clear a path. Nobody paid him much attention. They were all focused on the spectacle ahead, where the girl was being led toward the tree with its waiting noose. "Any last words?" Brackett called out, playing to the crowd like an actor on a stage. The girl raised her head. When she spoke, her voice was steady, unbroken, carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet square. "My name is Nantan. It means spirit talker in my people's tongue. I am not afraid to join my ancestors. But you," her dark eyes swept across the crowd, settling finally on Brackett, "you will answer for this cowardice when the spirits come for you in the dark." Someone in the crowd spat. "Heathen nonsense!" "Shut her up and get on with it," called another voice. But Jed saw the way some faces in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Frontier folks were a superstitious lot, and there was something in the girl's voice, something in the absolute certainty of her words that reached past their bloodlust and touched older, deeper fears. Brackett clearly felt it too. His bluster faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Well then, reckon we'll all find out together, won't we?" He nodded to his deputies. Morrison fitted the noose around Nantan's neck with shaking hands while Foley led the horse that would carry her to her death. They boosted her onto the animal's back, her bound hands making it impossible to balance properly. She swayed dangerously, but her face remained composed. "Any of you God-fearing folks want to say a prayer for the condemned?" Brackett's voice dripped with mock piety. Preacher William stepped forward, a thin man with watery eyes and a Bible he clutched like a shield. "Lord, we ask that you receive this lost soul with mercy, and that her death might serve as a warning to others who would transgress against your people and your laws." "Amen," the crowd murmured. Jed wanted to vomit. He'd heard prayers like that before, seen men wrap their cruelty in scripture and call it holy. It was one of the reasons he'd stopped talking to God after Sarah died. What was the point of praying to a deity who let good people suffer while evil ones prospered? "All right then." Brackett raised his hand. "Let justice be." "Wait." The word tore from Jed's throat before he could stop it. Every eye in the crowd turned toward him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. His heart hammered against his ribs, but it was too late to retreat now. "Something wrong, Harper?" Brackett's voice was dangerously quiet. "Just what exactly did she steal? What's it matter? Theft is theft." "Humor me." Brackett's eyes narrowed. "Loaf of bread, some dried meat, couple of apples from the Henderson place. Food." The word sat heavy in the air between them. She stole food. "Property is property," Martha Henderson spoke up from the crowd. "We work hard for what we have. Can't have every savage in the territory thinking they can just take what they please." Jed looked at Martha, a woman who'd never missed a meal in her life, whose husband owned more land than he could work and more cattle than he could count. Then he looked back at Nantan, at the sharp edges of her collarbones, visible through her torn dress, at the hollow spaces beneath her cheekbones that spoke of genuine hunger. "When's the last time any of you went a day without eating?" he asked the crowd. "That ain't the point," someone called out. "Isn't it?" Jed stepped closer to the tree, close enough to see the rope burns around Nantan's wrists, the split lip that had only recently stopped bleeding. "Look at her. Really look. When's the last time you think she had a proper meal?" "Jed," Brackett's voice carried a warning, "you're walking into dangerous territory here." "Am I? Because it seems to me like the dangerous territory is where we hang children for the crime of being hungry." The crowd stirred uneasily. These were people who'd known hunger themselves, who'd fled to the frontier because there wasn't enough for them back east. They understood desperation, even if they'd convinced themselves to forget it. "She's Apache," Foley spoke up. "They killed the Murphy family, burned them out." "She do that?" Jed asked. "This girl here, she ride with that war party?" "Well, no, but nothing. You're about to murder a child because other people who happened to look like her did something terrible." Jed's voice was getting louder now, carrying across the square. "That makes sense to you? That sound like justice? Enough." Brackett stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. "I don't know what's got into you, Harper, but you best step back before what? Before you remember that murder is still murder, whether you do it in a back alley or dress it up with ropes and prayer." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension shifting restlessly in their traces. Jed could feel the mood of the crowd balanced on a knife's edge, could sense some of them wavering in the face of his words. But not Brackett. The sheriff's face had gone red with rage and embarrassment. "You calling me a murderer?" I'm calling you a man who's about to hang an innocent girl because it's easier than doing actual police work. She ain't innocent. She's a thief. She's a starving kid who took some food. You want to punish that, fine. Give her 30 days. Put her to work. But this, Jed gestured toward the noose, this is just revenge dressed up like law. Get back in line, Harper, or I'll arrest you for interfering with... You'll arrest me? Jed laughed, but there was no humor in it. For what's speaking my mind, last I checked that wasn't against the law yet. But even as he spoke the words, he could see the calculation in Brackett's eyes. The sheriff was weighing his options, trying to decide whether it was worth the trouble to silence the only voice of dissent in the crowd. The law is what I say it is, Brackett said finally, and I say this girl hangs tonight. He turned back toward the horse, raising his hand to give the signal. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation, their bloodlust temporarily satisfied by the promise of imminent violence. That was when Jed noticed something that made his blood run cold. Nantan's chest was moving, not the steady rise and fall of normal breathing, but the rapid, shallow gasps of someone fighting for air. The noose was already tight enough to restrict her breathing, and every small movement of the horse beneath her was making it worse. She was suffocating, slowly. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just going to hang her, they were torturing her first, letting her strangle by degrees while they watched and cheered. Jesus Christ, he whispered. What was that? Brackett's voice was sharp. Jed looked around the crowd at faces flushed with excitement, at children who would grow up thinking this was normal, at men and women who called themselves Christians while they watched a girl die by inches, and something inside him broke. Not the clean snap of a bone, but the slow grinding fracture of a dam under too much pressure. 8 years of silence. 8 years of trying to hold the world at arm's length. 8 years of telling himself that other people's pain wasn't his problem. All of it crumbling in the face of one simple truth. If he walked away now, if he let this happen without fighting, then he was no better than the rest of them. I said, he spoke louder this time, his voice carrying across the square, Jesus Christ, look at her. She's already dying. And she was. Her face was turning blue, her bound hands clawing uselessly at the air behind her back. The crowd was so focused on their righteous fury that they couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. Or maybe they could see it, and they just didn't care. The thought made something dark and terrible unfurl in Jed's chest. He'd seen evil before, had fought in the war, had watched good men die for bad reasons, but this was different. This was a special kind of cruelty, the kind that could only flourish when good people convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. Sheriff, he called out, his voice steadier now. You got a choice to make here. I already made it. No, you didn't, because I'm making you a different offer. Brackett turned, suspicion written across his features. What kind of offer? Jed stepped closer to the tree, close enough to see the panic starting to creep into Nantan's eyes as the noose tightened incrementally with each of the horse's movements. Close enough to see that she had maybe minutes left before the slow strangulation became irreversible. Let her go, he said simply. Cut her down, let me take her out of town, and you'll never see either of us again. The crowd erupted, voices rose in anger and disbelief, but Brackett held up a hand for silence. And why would I do that? Because I'm giving you the chance to walk away from this without blood on your hands. Because deep down you know this is wrong and you're looking for an excuse to stop it. You're mistaken about that. Am I? Then why haven't you given the signal yet? Brackett's hand had been raised for nearly a full minute, but he hadn't brought it down. He stood frozen, caught between his own bloodlust and something that might have been conscience. I'll tell you why, Jed continued. Because you're not a murderer, Tom Brackett. You're a lot of things, a bully, a coward, a man who thinks his badge makes him God, but you're not a killer, not of children anyway. She ain't a child, she's... Look at her. Jed's voice cracked like a whip, Really look. Strip away all your talk about savages and justice and law, and what do you see? A scared kid who was hungry enough to risk her life for some bread and dried meat. For just a moment, Brackett's mask slipped. Jed saw doubt flicker across his features, saw him look at Nantan, as if seeing her for the first time. The girl's face was purple now, her struggles growing weaker as the noose did its slow work. But then the moment passed. Brackett's expression hardened again, and Jed knew he'd lost whatever slim chance he'd had to reach the man's conscience. She made her choice when she decided to steal from white folks, the sheriff said. Now she lives with the consequences. Dies with them, you mean? However you want to put it. Brackett started to bring his hand down, and Jed knew he was out of time for talking, out of time for reason, for mercy, for anything except the kind of desperate action that either saved lives or ended them. He'd made such choices before in the war, had learned that sometimes the difference between a hero and a coward was measured in heartbeats in the space between thought and action. The knife was in his hand before he consciously decided to draw it, a Bowie knife with an 8-inch blade that he'd carried for 15 years and used for everything from skinning game to cutting rope to opening packages from the general store. Tonight, he was going to use it to cut down a dying girl. Harper! Brackett's voice was sharp with alarm. Put that away. But Jed was already moving, lunging toward the tree with a speed that belied his 43 years. The crowd scattered, sudden panic replacing their bloodthirsty excitement as they realized that the evening's entertainment had just taken an unexpected turn. Deputy Morrison reached for his gun, but Jed was already past him, the knife slicing upward in a silver arc that parted the hanging rope like it was made of paper instead of hemp. Nantan fell, not the long drop that would have snapped her neck clean, but a short, hard fall that knocked the wind from her lungs and sent her rolling in the dust at the base of the cottonwood. The noose was still around her neck, but she was breathing great, gasping lungfuls of air that sounded like salvation. She was alive. For about 2 seconds. Then the world exploded into chaos. Shoot him, someone screamed. He's helping the savage. Stop him. Guns were being drawn all around the square, and Jed realized with crystalline clarity that he'd just signed his own death warrant. There was no talking his way out of this, no reasoning with a mob that had been denied their blood sport. He was a dead man, but Nantan was alive, and somehow that felt like enough. He knelt beside her, his knife making quick work of the ropes around her wrists. Her eyes found his dark and wide, and filled with a confusion that matched his own. "Can you ride?" he asked quietly. She nodded, still gasping. "My horse, the bay mare at McKinnon's post. Can you make it that far?" Another nod. "Then go. Now, don't look back, don't stop, just ride north until you hit water, then follow it east. You understand?" "Why?" The word came out as a croak, her throat raw from the noose. It was a good question. Why had he done this? Why had he thrown away 8 years of careful isolation for a girl he didn't know, a stranger whose only crime was being hungry, in a town that had forgotten how to show mercy? He looked into her eyes and saw something he'd lost. When Sarah died, the absolute conviction that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, even when the odds were impossible and the cause seemed hopeless. "Because somebody had to," he said simply. The first shot rang out before he could say anything else. The bullet whined past his ear, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passage. More guns were firing now, the crowd scattering as armed men tried to get clear shots at the man who'd just ruined their evening's entertainment. "Go!" he shouted, pushing Nantan toward the street. She stumbled but kept moving her bare feet, finding purchase on the dusty ground. Jed drew his own pistol, a Colt, .45, that had seen him through the war and a dozen frontier towns since, and sent a shot over the heads of the nearest gunmen. It wasn't meant to kill, just to buy them a few precious seconds. It worked. The men dove for cover, giving Nantan the opening she needed. to reach the hitching post where Patience waited. The mare was a good horse, steady under fire and fast when she needed to be. If the girl could stay in the saddle, she had a chance. A slim chance, but still a chance. Jed sent another shot toward the courthouse, then turned to follow Nantan's path. He made it exactly 3 steps before something hit him in the back, like a sledgehammer, spinning him around and sending him to his knees in the dust. He'd been shot before, knew the sensation of lead tearing through muscle and bone. This one felt high and, to the right, painful, but probably not fatal if he could get to cover and stop the bleeding. But as he tried to push himself back to his feet, he saw Brackett standing 20 feet away with a smoking rifle in his hands. "Should have minded your own business, Harper." The sheriff was taking aim for a second shot, this one meant to finish the job. Jed raised his pistol, knowing he was too slow, too late, too. The shot that rang out didn't come from Brackett's rifle. It came from somewhere behind Jed, and it took the sheriff in the shoulder, with enough force to spin him completely around. Brackett's rifle went flying, and he hit the ground, hard, cursing, and clutching his wounded arm. Jed turned to see Nantan sitting astride Patience, a smoking derringer in her small hands. Her face was grim with determination, and her eyes held the same fire he'd seen when she'd faced down the noose. "I told you to go," he said. "My people don't abandon those who show us kindness," she replied. "Can you ride?" He could feel blood soaking through his shirt, but the wound wasn't as bad as he'd feared. The bullet had gone clean through the meat of his shoulder without hitting anything vital. He'd live. The question was whether they'd both live long enough to get out of Cold Pine. All around the square, men were recovering from their shock and reaching for weapons again. Some were helping Brackett to his feet, while others were forming a rough line to block the street that led out of town. "We're trapped," Jed said. "No," Nantan replied, her eyes scanning the surrounding buildings. "We're just thinking like white men. My people know other ways." She wheeled Patience around, heading not toward the main street, but toward the narrow alley that ran between the bank and the barber shop. It was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, and it led not out of town but deeper into the maze of back streets and side lots that made up Cold Pine's commercial district. Jed followed, trusting her instincts over his own. Behind them he could hear Brackett shouting orders, organizing a pursuit. They had minutes, maybe less, before the whole town came down on them like a hammer. The alley opened onto a back street that paralleled the main road, lined with outhouses and storage sheds. Nantan didn't hesitate, guiding Patience between the buildings with the skill of someone who'd spent her life moving unseen through hostile territory. They emerged behind the livery stable, where a handful of horses were penned in a small corral. Nantan slipped from Patience's back and began working at the gate latch. "What are you doing?" Jed asked. "Creating confusion." She swung the gate open and slapped the nearest horse on the rump, sending it bolting into the street. The others followed, their hoofbeats echoing off the surrounding buildings as they scattered in all directions. Smart girl. The loose horses would make it harder for the townspeople to organize an effective pursuit, and in the darkness it would be nearly impossible to tell which hoofprints belonged to their quarry. Shouts of confusion arose from the main street as the animals ran wild through the town center. Men cursed as they tried to corner spooked horses, and in the chaos no one noticed 2 riders slipping quietly out the back of town following a game trail that led into the hills. They rode in silence for the first hour, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Cold Pine. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by, and Patience seemed to sense the urgency of their situation. She picked her way carefully up the rocky trail, her hooves finding purchase on loose stone and shale. It wasn't until they reached the first ridge that Jed allowed himself to look back. Cold Pine spread out below them, like a collection of scattered stars, peaceful and innocent in the distance. There was no sign of pursuit, no torches moving along the trails that led out of town. Maybe they'd actually made it. "You're bleeding," Nantan said quietly. He was. The wound in his shoulder had reopened during the ride, and he could feel warm blood trickling down his back. But it wasn't the kind of bleeding that would kill him, Not if he could get it bandaged properly. "It'll keep until we find shelter," he said. She guided them to a cave hidden among the rocks, barely visible even in the moonlight. It was clear she'd been here before, had probably been using it as a hideout during her time in the hills. A small cache of supplies was hidden in the back, a blanket, some dried meat, a clay water jug. As she helped him out of his blood-soaked shirt, Jed got his first clear look at the girl he'd risked everything to save. Without the noose around her neck and the panic in her eyes, he could see that she was probably closer to 20 than 18, with the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. The bruises on her face told a different story, one of recent violence and systematic cruelty. Someone had worked her over pretty thoroughly before the mock trial, and not all of the damage was fresh. Some of the older marks suggested she'd been running for weeks, maybe months. "How long have you been alone out here?" he asked, as she cleaned his wound with water from the jug. "Since the first snow," she replied. "My band was attacked by soldiers. Most were killed. The survivors scattered. Family, dead, all dead." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but he could hear the pain underneath. "I have a sister who went north to live with the Lakota. I was trying to reach her when the hunger became too strong." She bound his shoulder with strips torn from her own dress, her movements quick and efficient. She'd done this before, had tended wounds in desperate circumstances. "The food you took," he said. "It was the first you'd eaten in how long? 3 days, maybe 4. Time becomes unclear when you're that hungry." 3 days. She'd gone 3 days without food, and when she finally broke down and stole some bread, they'd tried to hang her for it. The casual cruelty of it made his chest tight with anger. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what they did to you, for what this whole territory has become." She tied off the bandage and sat back on her heels, studying his face in the moonlight. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. My people and yours are enemies." It was the same question she'd asked in the town square, and he still didn't have a good answer. How could he explain that watching her die would have killed something essential in himself? That 8 years of self-imposed exile had made him forget who he used to be, and seeing her courage in the face of death had reminded him, "My wife used to say that we're all just people trying to get by," he said finally, "that the things that divide us are smaller than the things that connect us." Your wife is wise. Was. She died 8 years ago. Pneumonia. I'm sorry. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the empty miles like a lament for all the things that couldn't be saved. "What happens now?" Nantan asked. It was a good question. They couldn't go back to Cold Pine, that much was certain. Brackett would have wanted posters out by morning, and every lawman in the territory would be looking for the rancher who'd helped an Apache prisoner escape. His ranch was probably forfeit, his cattle scattered or stolen by the time he could return. 8 years of careful work gone in one night. The strange thing was he didn't regret it. Sitting in this cave with a wounded shoulder and an uncertain future, he felt more alive than he had since Sarah's death. For the first time in years, he'd acted instead of merely existing. He'd chosen to fight instead of hiding. It felt like waking up from a long gray dream. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose we figure it out as we go." You saved my life back there. That Derringer shot, without it, I'd be dead in the dirt right now. You saved mine first. Then I guess we're even." She smiled at that, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger and more hopeful despite everything she'd endured. "My sister lives near the Yellowstone River," she said. "It's a long way, but there are people there who would help us. People who don't care about the color of our skin or the languages we speak. Us. You can't go back to your old life. Neither can I, but maybe—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe we can build something new together." It was a crazy idea, A white rancher and an Apache girl traveling together across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, trying to reach a sanctuary that might not even exist anymore. The odds against them were astronomical. But as Jed looked into her eyes, those dark, fierce eyes that had stared down death without flinching, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said, "let's go build something new." Outside the cave, the coyote howled again, and this time it didn't sound like a lament. It sounded like a promise. As the night deepened around them, Jed Harper and Nantan began to plan their escape from everything they'd known, their journey towards something that might be called freedom. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, what dangers they'd face, what obstacles they'd have to overcome, what price they'd ultimately pay for choosing mercy over conformity. But they knew they'd face it together, these two unlikely allies who'd found each other in the shadow of a hanging tree and discovered that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let injustice have the final word. The girl who'd been marked for death was breathing free. The man who'd forgotten how to hope was remembering. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, a new story was waiting to be written. A story of fire and blood, of sacrifice and redemption, of two souls who'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. But that story would have to wait for dawn. The first gray light of dawn found them sharing the last of Nantan's dried meat, their backs pressed against the cool stone of the cave wall. Neither had slept much. The wound in Jed's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and every sound from outside sent them both reaching for weapons that might not be enough if Brackett's men had somehow tracked them through the darkness. "We need to move soon," Nantan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll start searching systematically once the sun is up." Jed nodded, testing the range of motion in his wounded arm. The bleeding had stopped, and the bandage held secure, but he could feel the stiffness setting in. By evening it would be worse, assuming they lived that long. "How well do you know this country?" he asked. "Well enough. There are ways through the hills that most white men don't know about. Old hunting trails, water holes, places to hide." She paused, studying his face in the growing light. "But it won't be easy. And if they bring dogs?" She didn't need to finish the thought. Dogs could follow a scent trail that would be invisible to human trackers, and they both knew Brackett wasn't the type to give up easily. The sheriff's pride had been wounded along with his shoulder, and men like that tended to hold grudges until they turned septic. "Then we'd better make sure they don't get close enough to use them," Jed said. They broke camp quickly, erasing what signs they could of their presence. Nantan scattered the ashes from their small fire and used a pine branch to sweep away their footprints, while Jed checked Patience's hooves for stones that might cause a limp. Every detail mattered now. One mistake, one overlooked track or smoldering ember could bring their pursuers down on them like wolves. The sun was just cresting the eastern peaks when they set out, following a game trail that wound deeper into the mountains. The path was barely visible, more suggestion than reality, marked by the occasional bent branch or deer dropping. But Nantan moved along it with the confidence of someone who'd learned to read the land like scripture. "Your sister," Jed said after they'd been riding for an hour. "What makes you think she's still alive? Still where you think she is?" "She sent word through traders last spring, said she'd found a place where the old ways were still respected, where children could grow up learning the stories instead of just learning to hide." Nantan's voice carried a note of hope that made Jed's chest tighten. "She said if I ever needed refuge, I should come north. Follow the water to where the earth touches the sky." "The Yellowstone country." "Yes, you know it. Spent some time up there before the war. It's beautiful country, but hard, and full of folks who don't take kindly to strangers." "Harder than this." She gestured toward the rocky landscape around them, where even the scrub brush looked like it was barely hanging on to life. Jed had to smile at that. She had a point. After 8 years in New Mexico territory, He'd almost forgotten what real grass looked like, what it meant to see trees that didn't have thorns and water that ran year-round. No, he admitted, not harder than this. They rode in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The trail climbed steadily, winding through stands of pinon pine and juniper that provided welcome shade from the strengthening sun. Somewhere below them, probably moving along the main roads, Brackett and his men were beginning their search. But up here in the high country, the world felt different, cleaner, somehow less tainted by the small cruelties of civilization. It was Nantan who first spotted the dust cloud. "There," she said, pointing toward a gap between two ridges that offered a view back toward Cold Pine. "Southeast, maybe 2 hours behind us." Jed shaded his eyes and followed her gaze. Sure enough, a thin plume of dust was rising from the valley floor, too regular and concentrated to be anything but mounted men, a lot of them from the size of the cloud. "How many you figure?" he asked. 15, maybe 20. They're following the main trail toward the foothills." 20 men. Brackett had managed to raise a proper posse, probably by promising the townspeople that capturing the Apache girl and her accomplice would keep them all safe from future raids. Fear was a powerful motivator, especially when it was mixed with the promise of righteousness. "They'll reach the high country by midday," Jed calculated. "Start working their way through the passes. How many ways are there to go from here? 3 main routes, but only one leads toward the water toward my sister. Then that's the one they'll concentrate on." "Yes." Nantan was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes studying the approaching dust cloud. "Unless we give them something else to think about." There was something in her tone that made Jed look at her sharply. "What are you thinking?" "My people have a saying, when the wolf pack is too large to fight, make them chase shadows instead of prey. Meaning, split up. I take the northern route, you take the eastern one. Whichever way they follow, the other has a chance to escape." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "We stay together." "It makes sense to—" "No," he repeated. "We're not splitting up. I didn't cut you down from that tree just to watch you ride off alone into country full of men who want to kill you. And I didn't save your life just to get you killed by my enemies." They stared at each other across the space between their horses, and Jed could see the stubborn determination in her eyes. She was serious about this, was willing to sacrifice herself if it meant he had a chance to get away clean. It was exactly the kind of noble, self-destructive gesture that Sarah would have made. "There's another way," he said finally. "We stay together, but we don't run, we fight. 20 men against the 2 of us. Not all at once. We pick them off. Use the terrain, use their anger against them. Make them come to us on ground of our choosing." Nantan considered this, her head tilted slightly to one side. "You've done this before." "During the war, I spent 2 years fighting behind Confederate lines, disrupting supply lines, picking off patrols. Same principle, stay mobile, hit fast, disappear before they can organize a response." "This isn't the war, isn't it?" Jed gestured toward the dust cloud, which was noticeably closer now. "Those men down there, they're not coming to arrest us. They're coming to kill us. What would you call that?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from the approaching posse to the rugged terrain around them. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the old days when warriors would defend the sacred places from those who would defile them. He said that sometimes the spirits themselves would turn the very rocks and trees into weapons against the invaders." "You believe that?" "I believe that some things are worth defending even when the odds are impossible." She looked at him directly, and he saw that same fierce light in her eyes that had faced down the noose. "And I believe that you and I together are more dangerous than 20 angry white men think we are." Despite everything, the pain around his shoulder, the certainty that they were about to fight a battle they couldn't win, Jed found himself grinning. "All right, he said. "Let's go introduce them to some old-fashioned frontier hospitality." They spent the next hour preparing their ambush, using every trick Jed had learned during his guerrilla fighting days, and every bit of Apache tactical knowledge that Nantan carried in her blood. The game trail they'd been following narrowed as it climbed toward a high pass, with steep canyon walls on both sides and no easy way around. It was the perfect spot for a bottleneck, assuming they could convince their pursuers to enter it. "They'll be cautious," Jed said as they positioned loose rocks above the trail. "Brackett's no fool, whatever else he is. He'll know this is ambush country." "Then we give him a reason to stop being cautious," Nantan replied. She was working on something with her hands, weaving dried grass and small stones into what looked like a child's toy. "My people call this a ghost caller, when the wind catches it just right." She hung the contraption from a dead branch where it would be visible from the trail below. Even the slightest breeze made it spin and rattle, creating an eerie sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Sounds like spirits," Jed admitted, "or like a frightened girl hiding in the rocks, making noise without meaning to." Nantan's smile was sharp as a blade. "Men like Brackett, they hear what they expect to hear." They took positions on opposite sides of the narrow pass, each armed with both guns and a carefully prepared rock slide. The plan was simple: wait for the posse to bunch up in the bottleneck, then hit them from both sides while they had nowhere to run. It might not stop all of them, but it would thin their numbers and shake their confidence. The wait was the hardest part, lying motionless among the rocks, while the sun climbed higher and the wound in Jed's shoulder stiffened into a constant ache. Below them, the ghost caller rattled and spun in the morning breeze, its hollow sound carrying like a siren call to anyone who might be listening. And someone was listening. The first horseman appeared around the bend in the trail just before noon, a lean man in a deputy's badge who sat his saddle like someone who'd been riding hard for hours. He paused when he heard the sound from the ghost caller, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "You hear that, Sheriff?" the deputy called back over his shoulder. Brackett emerged from behind a boulder where he'd been taking cover, his left arm bound in a makeshift sling, but his right hand steady on his rifle. The wound Nantan had given him the night before didn't seem to have slowed him down much. "I hear it," the sheriff replied. "Sounds like our little bird is trying to hide in the rocks up ahead." More men appeared, townspeople Jed recognized, mixed with a few strangers who had the look of hired guns. They were well armed and well mounted, but there was something in their posture that spoke of uncertainty. They'd expected a chase, not a hunt through hostile terrain. "Could be a trap," offered one of the strangers, a scarred man with cold eyes who kept his hand near his gun butt. "Could be," Brackett agreed. "But we've got 20 men and they've got 2. I like those odds. The Apache girl, she knows this country better than we do. She's still just one girl, and Harper's a rancher, not a soldier." Brackett's voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "We go in careful, but we go in. I want them both before sunset." The posse began moving forward, bunching up just as Jed had hoped they would. The narrow trail forced them into a column with no room to spread out or take evasive action. Perfect. Jed caught Nantan's eye across the pass and saw her nod slightly. She was ready. He was just reaching for the rope that would trigger his rock slide when everything went wrong. The ghost caller, which had been rattling peacefully in the breeze all morning, suddenly went silent. Not because the wind had stopped, but because someone had grabbed it. Someone who wasn't Nantan. "Well, well," said a voice from directly behind Jed's position. "Look what we got here." Jed rolled over to find himself staring up at the business end of a Winchester rifle held by a man he'd never seen before, a bearded giant in buckskins who'd somehow managed to climb the canyon wall without making a sound. "Afternoon, friend," the stranger said pleasantly. "Name's Frank Dalton. I'm what you might call a tracker by trade." Across the pass, Jed could see that Nantan was in similar trouble. 2 more men had appeared behind her position, their guns trained on her back. The careful ambush they'd planned had turned into a trap with them as the bait. "Brackett," Dalton called down to the posse. Got 'em both up here, just like you figured." The sheriff's triumphant laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "Bring them down. Time to finish what we started last night." As rough hands hauled him to his feet, Jed caught Nantan's eye one last time. He saw resignation there, but not defeat. Whatever happened next, she wasn't going to make it easy for them. Neither was he. "You boys made one mistake," he said conversationally as Dalton's men bound his hands. "What's that?" the tracker asked. "You assumed we didn't have a backup plan." It was a bluff, of course. They'd had no backup plan beyond the ambush that had just failed spectacularly. But sometimes a good bluff was all you needed to plant a seed of doubt. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "What kind of backup plan?" "The kind that starts when I don't come back to camp by sunset," Jed said, improvising desperately. "See, I've got friends up in these hills, friends who know what happened in Cold Pine last night, and if something happens to me and the girl—" He let the words hang in the air, watching as uncertainty flickered across Dalton's features. It was a thin thread to hang their lives on, but sometimes thin threads were stronger than they looked. "He's lying," one of the other men said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Maybe," Dalton replied, "but maybe not. We'll let the sheriff sort it out." They were dragged down the canyon wall like sacks of grain, their feet barely touching the rocky slope as their captors hauled them toward the waiting posse. Jed's shoulder screamed in protest, fresh blood seeping through the bandage, but he gritted his teeth and stayed silent. Pain was just another enemy to be endured. Brackett was waiting at the bottom with a smile that belonged in a wolf's mouth. "Well, if it isn't the hero of Cold Pine, how's that shoulder feeling, Harper?" "Like I should have aimed higher," Jed replied. The backhanded blow caught him across the cheek with enough force to split his lip. Stars exploded behind his eyes, but he stayed on his feet. "Careful, Tom," Dalton warned. "We still don't know if he was telling the truth about those friends of his." "What friends?" Brackett's voice was sharp. Dalton explained what Jed had said, and the sheriff's expression grew thoughtful. "You think he's bluffing, probably, but these hills are full of places to hide if there really are folks up here who might come looking for revenge." Brackett was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. Finally, he turned to face Jed directly. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to tell me everything about these supposed friends of yours. Where they are, how many of them there are, what kind of firepower they've got. You do that, and maybe I'll make this quick for both of you. And if I don't, then I give you to the boys here for some entertainment before we string you up proper, and I make sure the girl goes first nice and slow so you can watch." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Jed felt something cold and deadly uncurl in his chest. He'd known men like Brackett in the war, men who enjoyed having power over others, who mistook cruelty for strength. "You want to know about my friends?" he said quietly. "That's right. Well, there's about 30 of them, veterans mostly, boys who learned to fight dirty in places like Antietam and Gettysburg. They've been living rough up in these hills for years, and they don't much care for the law as it's practiced in towns like Cold Pine." It was all lies, of course, but Jed was counting on Brackett's paranoia to make it believable. The frontier was full of stories about Civil War veterans who'd never quite made it home, who'd formed outlaw bands in the wilderness rather than try to fit back into civilized society. "Where?" Brackett demanded. "Hidden Valley, about 10 miles north of here. Used to be a mining camp before the vein played out. They call it Haven now, and they don't welcome visitors." More lies, but delivered with the kind of detail that made them sound true. Jed could see doubt creeping into the faces around him, could sense the posse's confidence beginning to waver. "How do we know you're not just making this up?" one of the townspeople asked. "Because," Nantan spoke for the first time since their capture, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered men. "He's telling the truth about the valley. I've seen it. The spirits there are very angry." The way she said it with absolute conviction, as if she were describing something she'd witnessed personally, sent a ripple of unease through the posse. These were frontier folks, people who lived close enough to the edge of civilization to remember older fears. Indian superstition, Brackett said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Is it? Nantan's dark eyes found his. Then why do your own people avoid that place? Why do they cross themselves when they ride near it and speak of it only in whispers? She was improvising, building on Jed's lie with the skill of a born storyteller, but there was something in her manner, some quality of absolute belief that made even the skeptics shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Enough, Brackett's voice cut through the growing murmur of concern from his men. I don't care if there's a whole tribe of ghosts up there. We came here to do a job, and by God, we're going to finish it. But Jed could see that the damage had been done. The posse was no longer a unified force driven by righteous anger. Now they were a collection of individuals, each wondering if perhaps they'd bitten off more than they could chew. Fear was a powerful weapon, and he and Nantan had just turned it back on their captors. You want my advice, Sheriff? Dalton said quietly. We take what we came for and get out of these hills. Fast. Your advice? Brackett's voice was dangerously quiet. I'm paying you to track, not to think. You're paying me to get results without getting your men killed. Right now, I'm thinking those might be mutually exclusive goals. The tension between the two men was palpable, and Jed realized that the posse's unity was fracturing before his eyes. Brackett represented law and order, such as it was in Cold Pine, while Dalton represented pragmatic survival. And in the wilderness, survival usually trumped ideology. I say we finish them here and now, said the scarred gunman who'd been with Dalton. Quick and quiet, then get back to town before dark. No, Brackett said firmly. They're going back to Cold Pine. Public trial, public execution. The whole territory needs to see what happens to those who interfere with justice. That's a day's ride, Dalton pointed out. Maybe more if we run into trouble. Then we'd better not run into trouble. The tracker looked around at the canyon walls rising on either side at the narrow trail that would force them to travel in single file for miles. His expression was that of a man who'd just been asked to walk through a graveyard at midnight. Your funeral, he said finally. Yes, Brackett replied. It is. As the posse prepared to move out, binding Jed and Nantan to their saddles like captured livestock, Jed caught the girl's eye. She was watching him with an intensity that suggested she was trying to communicate something, but he couldn't quite make out what. Then he saw her glance meaningfully toward the sky, and he understood. The sun was directly overhead now, but it wouldn't stay there. In a few hours it would be sinking toward the western peaks, and by evening it would be painting the canyon walls with long shadows, shadows that could hide a multitude of sins, or a multitude of opportunities. The ghost caller had gone silent, but that didn't mean the ghosts were done with Cold Pine's vengeful sheriff. It just meant they were waiting for full dark to make their presence known. The shadows were just beginning to stretch across the canyon floor when the first shot rang out. It came from somewhere high above the narrow trail, the crack of a rifle echoing off the stone walls like thunder. The bullet struck the rocks inches from Brackett's horse, sending up a shower of sparks and stone chips that made the animal rear in terror. Ambush, Dalton shouted, diving from his saddle as more shots erupted from the canyon rim. The posse scattered like startled quailmen and horses tangling together in their desperate scramble for cover. Some made it behind boulders, others flattened themselves against the canyon wall, but 3 weren't fast enough. They went down in the first volley, their screams mixing with the whine of ricocheting bullets. Jed found himself on the ground beside his horse, still bound but very much alive. Through the chaos, he caught sight of Nantan pressed against a rock, outcropping her dark eyes, scanning the rim above with the focused intensity of a hunter. How many? Brackett bellowed from behind a fallen log, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. Can't tell, Dalton replied. At least 6, maybe more. But Jed was counting muzzle flashes, watching the patterns of fire, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There weren't 6 shooters up there. There was one, One shooter moving fast along the rim, changing positions between shots to create the illusion of multiple attackers. It was a classic guerrilla tactic, one he'd used himself during the war, and it was being executed with deadly precision. The question was, who there? One of the surviving townspeople pointed toward a cluster of boulders near the canyon's mouth. I saw a muzzle flash. Half a dozen rifles swung toward the spot, pouring lead into the rocks with enthusiastic inaccuracy. Chunks of stone flew in all directions, but the return fire never slackened. If anything, it seemed to intensify. "We're sitting ducks down here," the scarred gunman yelled. "We need to get to higher ground and leave ourselves exposed crossing open ground." Dalton shook his head. "That's what they want us to do." Jed twisted his wrists against the ropes that bound them, feeling the hemp fibers begin to fray. The knots were tight, but whoever had tied them hadn't accounted for the sweat and blood that was making his hands slippery. Given enough time, another volley crashed down from above, and this time one of the bullets found its mark. The man next to Dalton, a farmer from Cold Pine whose name Jed couldn't remember, jerked once and lay still, his chest painted crimson. "That's 4 down," Brackett called out. "We can't stay here." "We can't leave either," Dalton replied. "They've got us pinned." That was when Jed heard a sound that made every nerve in his body stand at attention. It was low and rhythmic, barely audible over the gunfire, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever served in the cavalry. War drums. Not the massive ceremonial drums used in tribal gatherings, but the smaller portable instruments that Apache warriors had carried into battle for generations. The sound was coming from multiple directions, now echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed to surround them completely. "Jesus Christ," one of the townspeople whispered. "How many of them are there?" That was the point, of course. The drums were meant to confuse, to make a small force seem larger, to turn the mind against itself with primal fears that predated civilization. And they were working. Jed could see the panic spreading through the posse, like wildfire could watch as disciplined men reverted to frightened animals. "It's psychological warfare," Dalton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're trying to spook us." "Well, it's working," Brackett snapped. "Half my men are ready to run." "Then maybe we should listen to them." The sheriff's head snapped around his eyes, blazing with fury. "We're not running from a handful of savages. Those savages are picking us off one by one. We've lost 4 men in 10 minutes and we haven't even seen them clearly. Because they're cowards hiding in the rocks instead of fighting like men." Jed almost laughed at that. Brackett was complaining about his enemies using smart tactics instead of lining up to be shot. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten so many good soldiers killed during the war, the belief that courage meant standing in the open while your enemies found cover. The drums were getting louder now, joined by something else, voices raised in what sounded like a war chant. The words were in Apache, too fast and distorted by echoes for Jed to make out, but their meaning was clear enough. "We are here, we are many, you are going to die." "Sheriff," one of the remaining townspeople called out, his voice high with fear, "maybe we should think about—" His words were cut off by a scream from somewhere above, not a war cry this time, but the sound of a man in mortal agony. It echoed off the canyon walls for long seconds before fading into silence. "That was Henderson," someone whispered. "They got Henderson." "How?" Dalton demanded. "He was right there five minutes ago." But Henderson's position behind a pile of fallen rocks was empty now, marked only by a dark stain on the stone and a rifle that lay abandoned in the dust. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Men who'd been eager for a fight an hour ago were now jumping at shadows, seeing enemies in every rock formation, hearing war cries in every echo. The careful discipline that had held the posse together was crumbling like sand. That was when Jed felt the rope around his wrists finally give way. The frayed hemp parted silently, freeing his hands for the first time since their capture. He kept his arms positioned as if he were still bound, waiting for the right moment. Around him the gunfight continued, but he could tell that the defenders were running low on ammunition. Their rate of fire was slowing, becoming more selective. Time was running out. He caught Nantan's eye and saw that she was watching him intently. When he flexed his fingers slightly, showing her that his hands were free, she nodded almost imperceptibly. She was ready. The question was ready for what? Their weapons had been taken. Their horses were scattered and they were surrounded by armed men who wanted them dead. Even if they could get free of their immediate captors, they'd still be trapped in a canyon with nowhere to run. Unless... Jed looked up at the rim where muzzle flashes still sparkled like deadly stars. Whoever was up there, and he was beginning to have his suspicions about who it might be, they were doing more than just shooting randomly. They were herding the posse, driving them toward a specific point in the canyon, toward the rockfall. During their earlier reconnaissance, he and Nantan had identified several places where the canyon walls looked unstable, where a little pressure in the right spot might bring down tons of stone. They'd planned to use that knowledge in their failed ambush, but perhaps their mysterious ally had the same idea. "Brackett," Dalton's voice was sharp with urgency. "We need to move now. Move where they've got us surrounded, back the way we came. At least we know that route is clear. Like hell, we didn't come this far to run with our tails between our legs." But even as he spoke, another of his men cried out and fell, clutching a shoulder that was rapidly turning red. The steady attrition was taking its toll, and everyone could see that their position was becoming untenable. "Sheriff," the scarred gunman said carefully, "sometimes the smart play is to live to fight another day." "I don't want to hear it." "Then maybe you should listen to this." The voice came from directly above them, amplified by the canyon walls, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was female, speaking English with only the slightest accent, and it carried the kind of absolute authority that made even Brackett look up. "You have 10 minutes to release your prisoners and leave this sacred place," the voice continued. "After that, the mountain spirits will claim you all." "Sacred place?" Brackett laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's a damn canyon. This is where my ancestors came to speak with the dead," the voice replied. "This is where warriors were buried with honor, where medicine men communed with spirits. You have brought violence to a place of peace, and the land itself will punish you for it." Jed felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There was something in that voice, some quality of absolute conviction that made the threat feel real and immediate. "Superstitious nonsense," Brackett muttered, but his men were looking around nervously, suddenly seeing the canyon walls not as tactical features, but as the boundaries of a graveyard. "Is it?" The voice seemed to come from a different direction now. "Look around you, count your dead. The spirits are already at work." And it was true. In less than 20 minutes, the posse had lost nearly a quarter of its strength to an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't pin down, couldn't even count accurately. Men who'd ridden out of Cold Pine full of righteous confidence were now huddled behind rocks, like children afraid of the dark. 9 minutes, the voice called out. That was when Jed heard something that made his blood freeze. It was subtle at first, just a change in the quality of the echoes, but it was growing steadily louder. Rumbling. Not thunder, the sky was clear. Not horses, the sound was too deep, too sustained. This was the sound of stone moving against stone, of geological forces being unleashed by human intervention. "Rock slide," he whispered. Nantan heard him and nodded grimly. She'd recognized the sound too, knew what it meant. Somewhere above them, their mysterious ally was bringing down the mountain. 8 minutes. The rumbling was definitely getting louder now, and some of the posse members were beginning to notice. Heads turned upward, eyes searching the canyon rim for signs of movement. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very bones of the earth were shifting. "We need to get out of here," Dalton said, and this time his voice carried real fear. "Right now. I'm not running from 7 minutes." The voice cut through Brackett's protest like a knife. There was something different about it now, something that suggested the speaker was no longer making empty threats, but stating simple facts. "Sheriff," one of the surviving townspeople said quietly, "maybe we should—" He never finished the sentence. The rock slide, when it came, started small, just a trickle of pebbles from high above. But within seconds it had become a torrent, then an avalanche, tons of stone cascading down the canyon wall with the roar of an angry god. The posse scattered in every direction, men and horses fleeing for their lives, as the mountain came apart above them. Boulders the size of houses bounced off the canyon walls, sending up clouds of dust and debris that turned day into twilight. In the chaos, Jed rolled toward Nantan, his freed hands working frantically at the ropes that bound her wrists. The knots were tight, but fear gave him strength and dexterity. As the rock slide thundered around them, he felt the hemp give way. "Can you move?" he shouted over the noise. "Yes, then we go now." They ran not toward the mouth of the canyon, where Brackett's scattered men were regrouping, but deeper into the maze of rock formations and hidden passages that only someone who knew the country intimately could navigate. Behind them, the avalanche continued its devastating work, reshaping the landscape with brutal efficiency. When the rumbling finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as shocking as the noise had been. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the familiar canyon had been transformed into an alien landscape of shattered stone and newly carved channels. Of the 20 men who'd entered the canyon in pursuit of justice, perhaps half remained. The others lay buried beneath tons of rock, their bodies entombed in a monument to the folly of pursuing vengeance into places where older powers held sway. "This way," Nantan whispered, leading him through a gap between two fallen boulders. "I know a place we can hide until dark." They climbed for 20 minutes, following pathways that seemed to exist more in memory than in current reality. The rock slide had changed everything, creating new passages while closing off others, but Nantan navigated the transformed landscape with the instincts of someone who'd learned to read the bones of the earth. The cave she led him to was small and well hidden, accessible only through a crack in the rock face that looked like a natural shadow. Inside, it opened into a chamber barely large enough for 2 people, but it was dry and defensible. "Who was that?" Jed asked as soon as they were safely hidden. "The woman with the voice, my sister," Nantan replied simply. "Your sister, but I thought she was up north with the Lakota." "She was. But when the trader brought word of what happened in Cold Pine, she came south to find me." Nantan's smile was fierce with pride and love. "She always said she would come if I needed her." "How did she know where to find us?" "She's been tracking the posse since yesterday, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the rock slide? Something she learned from our grandfather. He used to say that the mountains themselves would fight for those who respected them." Nantan paused, listening to the voices echoing from the canyon below. It seems he was right. Through the crack that served as their window, they could see the survivors of Brackett's posse regrouping near the canyon mouth. Even from a distance, it was clear that the fight had gone out of them. These were broken men, their confidence shattered along with the mountain above them. "Count them," Jed said quietly. Nantan peered through the gap, her lips moving silently as she tallied the survivors. 9, she said finally. "Maybe 10. It's hard to tell with all the dust." Less than half the original force. The canyon had claimed its tribute in blood and bone, and the men who remained were no longer the confident manhunters who'd ridden out of Cold Pine that morning. They were survivors of a disaster, shell-shocked and demoralized. "They'll go back," Nantan said with certainty. "They've seen enough death for one day." "Will they, or will Brackett try to salvage something from this mess?" As if in answer to his question, they heard the sheriff's voice carrying across the canyon, thick with rage and frustration. "We're not leaving without them. I don't care if the whole damn mountain comes down." "Sheriff?" Dalton's voice was tired and strained. "We need to be realistic here. We've lost more than half our men, our supplies are scattered, and there's obviously more than just 2 fugitives up here. Then we get reinforcements. Send word back to town, raise another posse. With what you've already got, every able-bodied man in the territory out here, and look how that worked out." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of wounded men moaning and horses snorting nervously in the settling dust. When Brackett spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less determined. "This isn't over. Harper and the girl think they've won something here, but all they've done is make it personal. It was already personal for you, Tom. That's what got us into this mess. Are you questioning my judgment? I'm questioning your sanity. We came out here to bring back 2 fugitives, and instead we walked into a trap that cost us 11 good men. At some point you have to ask yourself if your pride is worth more lives." Jed felt a chill run down his spine. Dalton was right. This had stopped being about law and order the moment Brackett decided to pursue them into the high country. Now it was about a man's wounded ego, about his need to prove that he couldn't be defied with impunity. And men like that were the most dangerous kind of enemy because they never knew when to quit. "We'll make camp below the canyon," Brackett said finally. "Tend to the wounded, regroup, and figure out our next move." "Tom, that's Sheriff Brackett to you, Dalton, and my next move is to finish what we started. Harper and his Apache friend want to play games with forces they don't understand, fine, but they're going to learn that there are some fights you can't win by hiding in the rocks." Through the crack in the stone, Jed could see the posse beginning to withdraw, carrying their wounded and leading their scattered horses toward the mouth of the canyon. But there was something in their movements, a deliberateness, that suggested they weren't really retreating. They were regrouping. "He's not giving up," Jed said quietly. "No," Nantan agreed. "Men like him never do. They keep fighting until someone stops them permanently. Your sister, where is she now?" "Close, watching. She'll wait until dark, then find us. And then we decide whether to run or fight." Jed was quiet for a moment, considering their options. Running made sense. They'd bloodied Brackett's nose, cost him half his men, and demonstrated that he wasn't the unstoppable force he'd thought himself to be. It would be the smart play to disappear into the wilderness and let the sheriff explain to the people of Cold Pine why their loved ones weren't coming home. But smart plays didn't always satisfy the soul. "There's another option," he said slowly. "What's that? We end this, tonight, once and for all." Nantan studied his face in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. "You're talking about killing him." "I'm talking about stopping him, permanently. Because if we don't, he'll keep coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Men like Brackett don't forgive and they don't forget. And men like you." It was a fair question. What kind of man was he really? A rancher who'd wanted nothing more than to be left alone, a former soldier who'd seen enough killing to last several lifetimes, or something else entirely, something that had been sleeping for 8 years and was only now beginning to wake up. "I used to think I was a man who wanted peace," he said finally. "Turns out I'm a man who wants justice, and sometimes the only way to get justice is to take it." Outside their hiding place, the afternoon sun was beginning its long slide toward the western peaks. In a few hours, darkness would claim the canyon, and under cover of that darkness, one way or another, the long hunt would finally come to an end. But first, they had to survive until nightfall, and judging by the sounds echoing from below, Brackett wasn't planning to make that easy for them. The war for the canyon had only just begun. The shadows had grown long and purple when the first scream echoed from Brackett's camp below. It was cut short, replaced by shouts of alarm and the sound of men scrambling for weapons they couldn't see to use. "That's my sister," Nantan whispered, her eyes gleaming with fierce pride. "She's begun the night hunt." Jed pressed his eye to the crack in the rock, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding in the canyon below. Brackett's men had made camp in a natural amphitheater where the canyon widened, thinking the open space would protect them from ambush. Instead, it had made them perfect targets for a hunter who could move like smoke through the gathering darkness. "How many men does she have with her?" he asked. "None. She hunts alone." "One woman against 9 armed men. You've never seen her work?" Nantan's voice carried a note of something that might have been awe. "Our grandfather taught us both the old ways, but she was always the better student. She can move through enemy territory like a ghost strike without warning, disappear before they know what hit them." Another cry of pain rose from the camp, followed by Brackett's voice bellowing orders that his remaining men were too scattered and panicked to follow. In the failing light, Jed could see muzzle flashes as the survivors fired wildly at shadows, wasting ammunition on targets that existed only in their imagination. "Spread out," the sheriff was shouting. "Form a perimeter. Don't let her—" His words were cut off by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground, followed by a wet gurgle that spoke of a cut throat or a pierced lung. 7 men left, Jed calculated, maybe 6, depending on how badly wounded that last one was. "She's driving them toward us," Nantan observed, "pushing them up the canyon away from the horses and supplies. Why? Because that's where we can finish this." The night hunt continued for another hour, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the darkness with human lives as the stakes. Nantan's sister, whose name Jed still didn't know, was systematically dismantling what remained of Brackett's posse, picking off stragglers and wounded men with the ruthless efficiency of a born predator. But she was being careful not to kill them all. 3 men had died in the first assault, their bodies left, where they fell as warnings to the others. The rest were being herded, driven by fear and desperation, toward the narrow defile where Jed and Nantan waited in their hidden cave. There, Nantan pointed toward a shadow moving among the rocks far below. "Do you see her?" Jed squinted into the darkness, trying to separate one shadow from another. For a moment he saw nothing, and then a figure detached itself from what he'd thought was a boulder, moving with fluid grace across the broken ground. She was smaller than her sister, more compact, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little starlight filtered into the canyon. Her hair was braided with what looked like feathers and small bones, and she carried herself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never known defeat. "She's beautiful," he said without thinking. "She's death," Nantan replied matter-of-factly. "Beautiful death that comes for those who have no honor." As if she'd heard them talking, the figure below paused and looked directly up at their hiding place. Even across the distance and darkness, Jed felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. Then she raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a signal and melted back into the shadows. "She knows we're here. She's known since we arrived. She's been watching over us, protecting us." Nantan's voice was warm with love and gratitude. "Now she wants us to be ready for the final act." The sounds of pursuit were getting closer now. The harsh breathing of frightened men, the scrape of boots on stone, the occasional whispered curse when someone stumbled in the darkness. Brackett's survivors were climbing toward them, driven by an enemy they couldn't fight and couldn't escape. "How many?" Jed asked, checking his stolen pistol for the 3rd time. 4, maybe 5, including Brackett and Dalton. "Your sister did good work. She always does." They could see them now, dark shapes moving carefully up the treacherous slope toward their position. Brackett was in the lead, his wounded arm bound in a makeshift sling, but his gun hand steady. Behind him came Dalton and 2 others townspeople, whose names Jed couldn't remember, but whose faces he recognized from that night in Cold Pine. Where was the 5th man? Had Nantan miscounted, or was someone else moving through the darkness, trying to flank their position? The answer came in the form of a rifle shot from somewhere above and behind them. The bullet sparked off the rocks near Brackett's head, close enough to make him dive for cover, but not close enough to do real damage. "She's up there." Dalton pointed toward a ledge that overlooked their position. "On the rim." Then flush her out, Brackett snarled. You and Morrison take the left side. I'll go right with Jenkins. But as the men began to move, separating to attack the sniper's position from multiple angles, Jed realized that they were walking into exactly the trap that Nantan's sister had intended. By splitting up, they'd made themselves vulnerable to the two fighters hidden in the cave below. Ready, he whispered. Nantan nodded, her captured rifle steady in her hands. Take Dalton. I'll handle the one called Morrison. They emerged from their hiding place like avenging spirits, appearing behind Brackett's men just as the survivors were focusing all their attention on the threat from above. Jed's first shot took Dalton in the back, spinning the tracker around with a look of shock and betrayal on his weathered face. Nantan's rifle spoke a heartbeat later, and Morrison crumpled without a sound, his weapon clattering away into the darkness. That left Brackett and Jenkins, both of whom spun toward their attackers with the desperate fury of cornered animals. The sheriff's gun roared in the confined space, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding everyone within 50 feet. Jed felt the bullet tug at his shirt close enough to leave powder burns on the fabric. He rolled sideways, seeking cover behind a fallen boulder as Jenkins opened fire with his rifle, working the lever action with practiced speed. You! Brackett's voice was thick with rage and recognition. I should have killed you in Cold Pine. You should have, Jed agreed, sending a shot toward the sheriff's muzzle flash. But you were too busy playing to the crowd. Where's the Apache bitch? Jed's blood went cold at the casual cruelty in those words. Learning you some manners, he replied. As if summoned by his voice, Nantan appeared behind Jenkins like a shadow given form. The townsman never saw her coming. One moment he was firing at Jed's position, the next moment he was falling forward with Nantan's knife between his shoulder blades, which left only Brackett. The sheriff stood in the center of the small clearing, his gun tracking back and forth between Jed's cover and the darkness where Nantan had vanished. His breathing was harsh and labored, and in the starlight Jed could see that his wounded arm was bleeding again, the makeshift bandage dark with fresh blood. You think you've won something here, Brackett called out. You think killing my men makes you heroes. I think it makes us even. Jed replied, rising slowly from behind his boulder with his gun trained on the sheriff's chest. For what you did to those folks back in Cold Pine, for what you tried to do to her. She's a thief and a savage. She's a hungry girl who took some bread, and you tried to murder her for it. It's called justice. No, said a new voice from the shadows above. This is justice. Nantan's sister dropped from the ledge like a hunting cat, landing silently behind Brackett with a knife in each hand. The sheriff spun toward her, but he was too slow, too wounded, too exhausted from the long chase through the darkness. The first knife took him in the gun arm, severing tendons and sending his pistol spinning away into the night. The second stopped just short of his throat, the blade's edge drawing a thin line of blood below his jaw. Move and die, she said quietly. Brackett froze, his eyes wide with the sudden understanding that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. Up close, Jed could see that Nantan's sister was indeed beautiful, but it was the terrible beauty of a thunderstorm or a prairie fire, something to be admired from a safe distance. Sister, Nantan said, stepping into the circle of starlight. I had wondered when you would reveal yourself. I wanted to see if these white men had any honor, the other woman replied without taking her eyes off Brackett. They do not. My name is Ayana, she said, addressing Jed for the first time. It means eternal blossom in the old tongue, though most who meet me find that ironic. Thank you, Jed said simply, for everything. Do not thank me yet. We still have to decide what to do with this one. She pressed the knife a fraction deeper, and Brackett made a small choking sound. He has killed many of my people. He has brought shame to his own. What justice demands his death? Then kill him, Jed said. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise the others. A year ago, hell, a week ago, he would have argued for mercy, for giving Brackett a trial, or at least a quick death. But something had changed in him during the long chase through the mountains, something that had been burned away by the sight of a girl swaying from a noose and the sound of good men dying for bad reasons. "You sure about that?" Nantan asked quietly. "I'm sure. He had his chance to show mercy back in Cold Pine. He chose cruelty instead." "The law," Brackett started to say. "The law?" Ayana's laugh was like broken glass. "You speak to me of law. Your law that says my people have no right to exist. Your law that calls a starving child a thief and a murderer. It's not personal, it became personal the moment you put a rope around my sister's neck." Jed watched the play of emotions across Brackett's face. Fear, anger, desperate calculation. The sheriff was looking for an angle, some way to talk his way out of this, but there were no angles left, no appeals to law or custom that would save him from the consequences of his choices. "Wait," he said finally. "There's something you need to know about Cold Pine, about why we really came after you." "Keep talking," Ayana said, but her knife didn't move. "The girl, your sister, she wasn't just accused of theft. There was more to it." "What more?" Nantan's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Word came in yesterday, just before we rode out. There was an attack on a ranch about 50 miles south of here. Family named Crawford. They were all killed. The house burned, livestock scattered. And you think my sister was responsible?" Ayana's voice was deadly quiet. "Not her specifically, but the tracks. They showed Apache ponies. Unshod horses riding patterns that matched what we know about your people's tactics." Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's a war party operating in this territory, has been for weeks, and when we found your sister stealing food, we figured she was scouting for them, getting intelligence on which places were easy targets." "That's impossible," Nantan said. "I've been alone in these hills for months. There is no war party. The tracks don't lie, girl, neither do the bodies." But even as he spoke, Jed could see doubt creeping into Brackett's eyes. The sheriff was a bully and a killer, but he wasn't stupid. And something about this story wasn't adding up. "Describe these tracks," Ayana said suddenly. "What?" "The Apache ponies. Describe the tracks they left." Brackett shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't there personally. I'm going by what the rangers told me." "Which rangers?" "Does it matter? The point is, it matters because there are no Apache ponies south of here," Ayana said flatly. "All the bands in that region were moved to the reservation 2 years ago. Any horses they might have left behind would have been claimed by settlers or shot as strays. Maybe they came from somewhere else. Maybe you're lying." Nantan stepped closer, her rifle trained on the sheriff's chest. "Maybe there was no attack on any Crawford ranch. Maybe you made that up because you thought it would give you an excuse for what you did. Or maybe," Jed said slowly, a terrible suspicion taking shape in his mind, "somebody else made it up. Somebody who wanted to make sure you had a reason to come after us with everything you had." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. If Jed was right, if someone had fed Brackett false information about Apache raids, then this whole chase had been orchestrated from the beginning. Someone had wanted them out here in the wilderness, away from witnesses where they could be killed quietly, and their bodies left for the scavengers. "Who told you about the Crawford ranch?" Ayana asked, her knife steady at Brackett's throat. I can't remember. One of the deputies maybe, or try harder." "It was Dalton." The words came out in a rush. "Dalton brought me the report, said it came through territorial headquarters." Jed looked over at the tracker's body lying crumpled where Nantan's bullet had found its mark. Even in death, the man's face wore an expression of crafty intelligence, as if he were still calculating angles and working percentages. "Dalton was playing a deeper game," he said. Question is, who was he really working for? Does it matter now? Nantan asked. He's dead, brackets finished, and we're still alive. Isn't that enough? It should have been enough. By any reasonable measure, they'd won. They'd survived the lynch mob, escaped the posse, and turned the hunters into the hunted. Brackett's reign of terror was over, and the people of Cold Pine would think twice before trying to dispense frontier justice again. But something nagged at Jed, some instinct developed during long years of war and wilderness living. The story was too neat, too convenient. Real life was messier than this, full of loose ends and unanswered questions. There's something else, he said. Something we're missing. Like what? Like why Dalton was so eager to track us in the first place. Like why he kept pushing Brackett to take bigger risks, go further into hostile territory. Like why he seemed to know exactly where we'd run when we escaped from Cold Pine. Ayana's eyes narrowed. You think he was driving us toward this canyon deliberately? I think maybe somebody wanted us all dead, us, Brackett, all the witnesses to what really happened that night in Cold Pine. But who would? Nantan started to ask, then stopped, as understanding dawned in her eyes. The preacher. What about him? He was there when they tried to hang me, prayed over my body before they put the noose around my neck, but his hands. She shuddered at the memory. His hands were already bloody, fresh blood, like he'd just finished cutting something, or someone. Jed felt the pieces clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture that was ugly, but all too plausible. Williams, Preacher Williams. He's been playing both sides from the beginning. What do you mean? Think about it. He's got access to everyone in town, knows who's vulnerable, who's got money, who might be traveling alone. Perfect position for someone running a murder and robbery operation. And when things went wrong in Cold Pine, Ayana added, following the logic, when you saved my sister and made it look like the Apache were fighting back, he needed to clean up the mess. So he fed Dalton a story about Apache raids, knowing it would push Brackett into organizing a massive posse. Then he made sure Dalton was the tracker, the man who would lead everyone exactly where Williams wanted them to go. Into a trap, Nantan finished. Kill us all, blame it on Apache raiders, and nobody ever asked questions about what really happened to the Crawford family or anybody else. Brackett had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, and now his face was pale with understanding. Jesus Christ. You're saying Williams has been using me, using all of us. I'm saying you've been dancing to his tune from the beginning, Jed replied. The question is, how many other people has he killed while you were busy chasing shadows? I need to get back to town. I need to... The knife at his throat pressed deeper, drawing fresh blood. You're not going anywhere, Ayana said flatly. But if Williams is still out there, still killing people, then that's something for others to worry about. You have your own accounting to make. And with that, she drew the blade across Brackett's throat in one smooth motion, opening his carotid artery like a second mouth. The sheriff's eyes went wide with shock and betrayal, and he tried to speak, but only blood came out. He swayed for a moment, his hands clutching uselessly at his ruined throat, then toppled backward into the dust. It's finished, Ayana said, wiping her blade clean on the dead man's shirt. But Jed wasn't so sure. Williams was still out there, still weaving his web of murder and deception. The preacher had orchestrated this entire bloody drama, had sent good men to their deaths, to cover his own crimes, and he was probably back in Cold Pine right now, playing the grieving holy man whose congregation had been tragically lost in the wilderness. No, he said quietly. It's not finished. Not yet. The three of them sat in the darkness above Brackett's corpse, the weight of unfinished business settling over them like a shroud. In the distance, coyotes had begun their nightly chorus, but even their wild voices seemed muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Williams has to pay, Jed said, finally breaking the silence that had stretched between them since Ayana's blade had found the sheriff's throat. Going back to Cold Pine would be suicide, Nantan pointed out. By now, word will have spread that Brackett's posse never returned. The whole town will be armed and waiting. Maybe, or maybe they'll be grieving their dead and looking for someone to blame. Jed's voice was thoughtful, calculating. Fear makes people do stupid things, but grief makes them do predictable things. And what does Williams do when he's grieving? Ayanna asked. He prays, publicly, makes a big show of asking God to comfort the bereaved and bring justice to the guilty. You know this man well. Jed considered the question. He'd seen Williams around town for years, had watched the preacher work his particular brand of manipulation on the good people of Cold Pine. Williams was the type who never missed a funeral, never failed to appear at a bedside when someone was dying and might be persuaded to change their will. Well enough, he said. He's the kind of snake who hides behind scripture while he picks your pocket. And tomorrow morning he'll be standing on his pulpit telling everyone how Sheriff Brackett died a hero's death fighting the Apache menace. While painting targets on our backs, Nantan added grimly. Exactly. By the time he's done, every man, woman, and child in the territory will be looking for the savage who killed their protector. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight as she studied the dead men scattered around them. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. My grandfather used to say that some evils can only be ended with blood, that there are men so twisted in their hearts that mercy becomes a sin against the innocent. They will harm if allowed to live. Williams is one of those men, Jed agreed. Then we go back, she said simply. We end this. 3 of us against an entire town. 3 of us against one lying preacher, she corrected. The town doesn't matter if Williams is dead. And how do you propose we get to him? Cold Pine will be locked up tighter than a bank vault. Ayanna smiled, and in that expression Jed caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. It was the look of a predator who had just caught the scent of wounded prey. There are ways, she said, old ways, ways that don't require fighting through the front door. The plan they hatched in that canyon of the dead was audacious in its simplicity. While Cold Pine waited for Apache raiders who would never come, they would slip into town like ghosts, find Williams, and extract the kind of justice that territorial law had never provided. They would need 3 things: darkness, surprise, and the kind of cold-blooded courage that came from knowing you were absolutely right. As dawn approached, they made their preparations with the methodical care of people who understood that mistakes were measured in lives. Ayanna showed them how to move silently across different types of terrain, how to read the landscape for signs of ambush or pursuit. Nantan shared what she remembered of Cold Pine's layout, which buildings had back doors, which alleys offered concealment where Williams lived and conducted his business. Jed contributed his knowledge of the townspeople themselves, who could be trusted, who might help, and who would shoot first and ask questions later. The key is getting to Williams before anyone knows we're there, he said, as they gathered their weapons and what little supplies they could carry. Once word spreads that we're in town, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before every gun in the territory comes looking for us. Then we make those 10 minutes count, Ayanna replied. They spent the day moving carefully through the high country, staying off the main trails and avoiding the open ground where riders might spot them from a distance. The wound in Jed's shoulder had stiffened during the night, but the bleeding had stopped and the pain was manageable. He'd been hurt worse and kept fighting. By evening, they were positioned on the ridge overlooking Cold Pine, studying the town through the gathering dusk. Smoke rose from perhaps 24 chimneys, and lamplight glowed in windows where families were sitting down to dinner, unaware that death was watching them from the hills. Looks quiet, Nantan observed. Too quiet, Jed replied. Where are the guards? The sentries? If Brackett's posse really vanished into the mountains, this place should be armed like a fort. Unless Williams doesn't want guards, Ayanna said slowly. Unless he's counting on word not getting out about what really happened. What do you mean? Think about it. If the official story is that Brackett caught us and we're all dead, then there's no reason for the town to be afraid. Williams gets to play the grieving pastor, honor the dead heroes, and nobody asks uncomfortable questions about why he was so eager to see us killed. Jed felt that familiar chill of recognition. It made perfect sense from Williams' perspective. Let everyone assume the problem had been solved, then quietly dispose of any evidence that might contradict the official narrative. He's probably already composed the sermon, he said grimly, about how God's justice prevailed and the righteous triumphed over evil. Then let's give him something new to preach about. They waited until full dark before making their move, slipping down from the ridge like shadows given form. The outskirts of Cold Pine were deserted, the houses shuttered against the night and whatever dangers it might bring. Dogs barked as they passed, but dogs always barked at night in frontier towns. Williams lived in a small house behind the church, a modest dwelling that spoke of humble service while concealing the wealth he'd accumulated through years of carefully orchestrated theft and murder. Light showed in his windows, and they could see his shadow moving back and forth as if he were pacing. Nervous about something, Nanton whispered. Guilty conscience, Jed replied. He's probably wondering if his plan worked, if we're really dead, or if we might come looking for him. He's about to find out. They approached from 3 directions, moving with the patient care of hunters who knew their prey was dangerous. Ayana took the back door. Nanton positioned herself at the side window, and Jed moved toward the front entrance. Through the window he could see William sitting at his desk, a Bible open before him, but his attention focused on something else, a piece of paper that he kept reading and refolding, his hands shaking slightly with what might have been fear or excitement. Jed tested the front door and found it unlocked. Small town confidence, the kind that assumed neighbors were trustworthy, and strangers announced themselves honestly. He eased it open and stepped inside, his gun drawn, but not yet aimed. Williams looked up at the sound of the creaking floorboard, and for a moment their eyes met across the lamplit room. The preacher's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance. "I wondered when you'd come," he said quietly. "Did you?" Jed stepped fully into the room, keeping his weapon ready. "Or were you hoping Dalton had done his job properly?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. The fake report about Apache raids, the convenient intelligence that sent Brackett and his men straight into a trap, the plan to kill everyone who might connect you to whatever you've really been doing out here." Williams was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "How did you figure it out?" "Process of elimination, plus the fact that your hands were bloody before they ever put that noose around the girl's neck." "Ah." Williams nodded as if that explained everything. "The Crawford family? Yes, that was unfortunate, but necessary." Necessary. They'd started asking questions about some of the other disappearances, people who'd supposedly moved on to other territories, but whose belongings kept showing up in my possession. "Couldn't have that, could we?" The casual way he spoke about murder, as if it were just another business decision, made Jed's finger tighten on the trigger, but he forced himself to stay calm to gather information before acting. "How many?" he asked. "How many what? How many people have you killed?" Williams considered the question with the air of a man tallying his livestock. "Directly, perhaps a dozen. Indirectly, well, that's harder to calculate. There were the families who died during the Apache raids I arranged, the travelers who met with unfortunate accidents after I learned they were carrying large amounts of money, the sick and elderly who passed away peacefully in their sleep after making generous donations to the church." Jesus Christ. He's been remarkably understanding about the whole thing, actually. Turns out the Lord is quite practical when it comes to the needs of his servants. The back door opened silently, and Ayana stepped into the room like a shadow made flesh. Williams glanced at her, but showed no surprise. He'd clearly been expecting this moment for some time. "The Apache girl," he said conversationally. I must say you've caused me considerable inconvenience." "Good," Ayanna replied. "I suppose you want to know why I ordered your execution." "I know why. You're a murderer and a thief who hides behind the cross." "Oh, it's much more than that." Williams leaned back in his chair, warming to his subject. "You see, I've spent years building something beautiful here in Cold Pine. A perfect system where the sheep deliver themselves to the slaughter, where robbery looks like charity and murder appears to be God's will. And I threatened that system. Not you specifically, but the idea of you, the notion that someone might fight back, might resist the natural order I'd established. Can't have that, can we? Once people start thinking they don't have to accept their fate quietly, the whole structure begins to crumble." Through the side window, Jed could see Nantan taking position with her rifle. They had William surrounded now, trapped in his own lair, with nowhere to run. "So you decided to make an example of her," Jed said. "I decided to reinforce the lesson. Theft leads to death, resistance brings retribution, and the only safe path is submission to authority. Simple theology, really. And when that didn't work, when I cut her down, then I had to improvise. Dalton owed me several favors. I'd helped him cover up some unfortunate incidents during his tracking career, so he was willing to play along with the fiction of Apache raids, lead Brackett and his men into an ambush, eliminate all the witnesses, and blame the whole thing on savage violence. Except we survived. Yes, that was unexpected. I'd counted on Dalton being more competent than he proved to be." Williams glanced at the paper on his desk. "This is his final report, by the way, arrived by messenger just this evening. Apparently, he managed to track you to a canyon in the high country before the Apache got him." "Apache? Oh yes, quite a tragic story. Overwhelming numbers, coordinated attack, barely time to scribble a final message before they were overrun. Very heroic, very sad. The kind of tale that will keep the good people of Cold Pine obedient for years to come." Jed felt sick. Williams had already written the ending to this story, had crafted a narrative that would turn their victory into his propaganda. Even in defeat, the preacher was still manipulating events to serve his purposes. "There's just one problem with your story," Ayanna said quietly. "What's that? We're not dead yet." Williams smiled at that, a cold, calculating expression that transformed his features into something reptilian. "No, but you will be. And when your bodies are found tomorrow morning shot full of holes and mutilated in the traditional Apache fashion, the official story will be confirmed." "You're assuming we'll let ourselves be found." "I'm not assuming anything. You see, while we've been having this delightful conversation, my associates have been taking positions around this building. Former soldiers, mostly men who understand the value of following orders without asking uncomfortable questions." As if summoned by his words, dark shapes appeared at the windows, armed men who'd been waiting for some predetermined signal. Jed counted at least 6 of them, probably more, in positions he couldn't see. "You came here to kill me," Williams continued, "but I'm afraid you've walked into the same trap that claimed Sheriff Brackett. The only difference is that this time there won't be any survivors to contradict the official account." "You bastard." "I prefer pragmatist. The frontier is a hard place, Mr. Harper. It requires hard men making hard choices. I simply happen to be better at it than most." One of the shapes at the window moved, and Jed caught the glint of lamplight on a rifle barrel. They were surrounded, outgunned, and probably outmanned. Williams had turned their hunt into his ambush, had used their desire for justice as bait to draw them into a killing ground. But sometimes the best trap was the one that looked like certain death. "You know what your problem is, Williams," Jed said conversationally. "Do tell. You think like a chess player, always planning 3 moves ahead, always trying to control every piece on the board. And that's a problem, how? Because some of us learned to fight in wars where the board kept changing, where the rules got thrown out the window, and where the only way to win was to break everything and see what was left standing." Jed dove sideways just as the windows exploded inward glass, and gunfire filling the air with deadly fragments. But instead of seeking cover, he rolled toward William's desk, grabbing the oil lamp and hurling it against the far wall in one fluid motion. The lamp shattered, spreading burning oil across the dry wooden planks. Within seconds, flames were climbing the walls, turning the small room into a furnace. William's carefully planned ambush dissolved into chaos as his men tried to see through smoke and flames while avoiding the crossfire from their own weapons. Ayanna was moving like a dancer through the inferno, her knives finding targets with surgical precision. Nantan's rifle spoke from the side window, each shot carefully aimed at the muzzle flashes of William's men, and Jed advanced on the preacher himself, his gun steady despite the hellish conditions around them. Williams had drawn a pistol of his own, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. The careful control he'd maintained throughout their conversation had vanished in the face of genuine chaos, leaving him exposed as the coward he'd always been. "This isn't how it was supposed to end," he screamed over the roar of flames. "No," Jed agreed, putting his gun to the preacher's head. "It was supposed to end with you in hell." The shot was lost in the general cacophony of the burning building, but Williams crumpled to the floor, his schemes and manipulations finally silenced forever. "Time to go," Ayanna called out, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. They fought their way out through the back door, leaving the burning house and its remaining defenders behind. William's men were too busy trying to escape the fire to pursue them effectively, and by the time the flames had been brought under control, the three of them were already gone, vanished into the darkness, like the ghosts they'd been mistaken for. They regrouped at the cemetery on the edge of town, among headstones that marked the graves of people Williams had probably helped to fill. In the distance, they could see Cold Pine in chaos bucket brigades fighting the firemen, shouting orders, the organized tranquility of the preacher's domain dissolving into pandemonium. "It's finished," Nantan said, watching the flames consume what remained of William's house. "Yes," Jed agreed, "it's finished." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. Williams was dead, his network of murder and theft broken, but the damage he'd done would echo for years to come. The families he'd destroyed, the trust he'd betrayed, the innocent people he'd killed in service to his twisted vision of order, those wounds would take time to heal. And somewhere in the flames consuming the preacher's house, evidence of other crimes was being destroyed, other victims whose stories would never be told. "What now?" Ayanna asked. It was a good question. They were fugitives still wanted for crimes they hadn't committed but couldn't prove they were innocent of. Brackett was dead, Williams was dead, and most of the witnesses to what had really happened were buried under tons of rock in a canyon that few people even knew existed. "North," Jed said, finally. "Like we planned. To your people, by the Yellowstone, where we can start over, together, if you'll have a broken-down rancher who's probably too old to learn new ways." Nantan smiled at that, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since that night under the cottonwood tree. "I think my sister's people will find a place for a man who knows how to keep his word." "And what about justice?" Ayanna asked. "What about all the people Williams hurt who will never see him pay for his crimes?" Jed looked back at the burning town, at the chaos they'd left in their wake. Williams was dead, his schemes exposed to anyone who cared to look for the truth. It wasn't perfect justice that was a luxury the frontier rarely provided, but it was enough. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's just about making sure the evil stops." They walked away from Cold Pine as the eastern sky began to lighten, with the promise of dawn. Three souls who'd found each other in the shadow of a hanging tree and discovered that redemption was possible even in the darkest of places. Behind them, the flames died down to smoldering embers, and the town began the long process of trying to understand what had really happened in their midst. Some would choose to believe the comfortable lies Williams had woven. Others would ask harder questions and demand better answers. But for Jed, Harper, Nantan, and Ayanna, Those questions belonged to someone else now. They had their own future to build their own dreams, to chase their own promise of something better waiting beyond the northern horizon. The man who'd lived alone for 8 years was no longer alone. The girl who'd been marked for death was breathing free. And the warrior who'd come south seeking vengeance had found something more valuable than revenge. They'd found family. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them rode north toward a land where the old ways were still honored, where children could grow up learning stories instead of hiding, where courage was rewarded and mercy was possible. They rode toward home.